Thank you everyone for joining us this evening or morning in time if you're in Japan. My name is Dan Smith. I'm the Gerald L. Curtis Visiting Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. And this event is sponsored by the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia and also the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Study Center. I am very delighted to have the opportunity to moderate a roundtable featuring three top experts in Japanese politics who will share their thoughts on the recent October 31st lower house election in Japan and what we might think of as takeaways for the future building on the election results. We have Yusaku Horiuchi from Dartmouth College, Isola Kwan from Utah State University, and Charles McLean from the University of Michigan. We'll go in that order. And so after our speakers present their work, about 10 minutes each, we will have about 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience. If you have a question for any of the speakers, please submit that question via the Q&A option in Zoom, and I will moderate the discussion after the presentations. So without further ado, our first speaker will be Yusaku Horiuchi. Whenever you're ready, Yusaku, please go ahead.
So thank you very much for attending this online event, and I'm really glad that I will be one of the panelists and then also show my most recent research finding. And the title of my presentation, which is really short, is Do Policies Matter? And I've been examining this question with my collaborators in the past three lower house elections. And just, the short answer to this question is, according to my research with my collaborators, the answer seems to be just simply no. But this is still a kind of a puzzle in the Japanese politics, and I want to present this puzzle, and then I want to encourage the discussion among us. So I first want to show the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, as you know, the biggest party since 1955 in Japan. The seat share in the past, since 1983. And then red bars after the 1994 electoral reform. And we had electoral reform, and at the time of electoral reform, we expected, many commentators and scholars said that one of the purposes of electoral reform is to introduce two-party system. But what has happened is since 2005, except in 2009, in which Democratic Party of Japan had a landslide victory, LDP seat share is comfortably above 50%, even greater than 60%. So LDP, despite the fact that we had electoral reform, LDP is actually stronger than before the electoral reform. But that does not necessarily mean that LDP's policies are favorable. And then this figure is based on GG Press surveys, a nationwide survey, right after the cabinet was formed. And then when Koizumi became the prime minister in 2001, that was a big excitement. And Hatoyama as well, DPJ, had a landslide victory in 2009. Also 60% above plus the approval rating right after the cabinet was formed. And then when it comes to the most recent one, of course, Kishida, this is the result published, I think, yesterday. It's just a 40.3%. It's the beginning of his cabinet, but the percentage of approval is below 50%. It is low. And then I just want to compare the presidential approval rating of the United States, the Joe Biden. This is actually the figure updated today. As of today, according to 538, approval rating is 43.2%, and many media say that this is bad, and the Biden's approval rating is seriously dropping. But this 43.2% is still larger than the honeymoon effect of the Kishida, which is still just a 40.2%. So to understand how much the policy preferences and vote choice are associated, we did a conjoint analysis. And some of you know what that is. But we did a nationwide survey using Qualtrics survey and a reasonably representative sample, reasonably high quality the responses. And I did a similar experiment with Dan Smith and Teppei Yamamoto in 2014. And then 2017, Shiro Kuriwaki and Dan again. And this time I'm working with Shusei Eshima and Dan Smith. And the idea is just to show the table of policy proposals by major political parties. And we see tables like this often. And so Jiminto's coronavirus policy is this, and then compared to that, Komeito is this. And so many similar tables are often presented by news media. And a conjoint analysis actually doing something similar. But the key difference is we randomly generate the hypothetical political parties. So this is a screenshot of our conjoint analysis. And then party A and party B, actually party 1 and party 2, the two columns, and these are hypothetical political parties. And then rows corresponds to the major policy issues. So in 2021, after checking policy manifestos and newspaper summaries and reading newspapers, we thought these 6 are the major policy areas: nuclear power and energy, diplomacy and national security, diversity and symbiotic society, and then coronavirus policy and economic policy. But the contents of those, each of these profiles is randomly generated based on the actual political parties' policy positions. And then we ask which party would you support, party 1 or party B. And this approach, this statistical method, survey design, is quite useful to understand the multidimensional preferences when it comes to voters make a choice of a particular party. And then our goal is to understand which particular policy issues are most important, and within each policy areas, which parties' policies are strongly associated with the support of the party. And given the time constraint, I perhaps need to skip these slides, but these are the LDP policies: coronavirus, and then economic policy, diplomacy and security, and nuclear power and energy, and diversity and kyosei shakai, symbiotic society. And then based on these, our summaries of the policies by major parties, we estimated the results. Okay, the way to look this, for those who are familiar with the conjoint, this figure is showing average marginal component effects. So if dots, we say this is airplane plot, because each dot looks like airplane. If airplane is on the right-hand side, that means policies of those parties like Komei, CDP, JCP, Ishin, and DPP are more favorable, meaning LDP's policies are less popular. So the baseline is LDP. But if those airplanes are on the left-hand side, then LDP's policies are more popular because they are negative compared to the baseline LDP. And what you can see is, except some the cases, LDP's policy is actually not so popular. Then I want to go through some of the major points. The number one, the COVID policies, the policy support, the association between the party choice and the policies are about the same and not much difference from LDP. But we found there is one clearly the policy that was clearly not favorable among Japanese people, which is CDP's policy. All people entering Japan should be quarantined in hotels for at least 10 days. I am personally strongly against this, so I'm actually happy to see this result. And the results suggest that Japanese people also didn't like this policy. And then all of these diversity, the policies are positive and statistically significant. And the LDP is the only party that didn't say that the government will allow married couples to have separate surnames. So Fufu Besse Hoan was one of the major issues in 2021 elections. This one is also interesting. The Komei-to's economic policy is so unfavorable. And then this is actually the topic discussed in the last several days, which is Komei-to insisted that the Japanese government should provide 10 万yen, 100,000 yen, worth of benefits for children of all age from 0 to 18. But this was significantly disfavored compared to the economic policies by all the other parties. And then, except this one, the other opposition parties' economic policies are favored compared to LDP. And then our interpretation is all of these parties mentioned the lowering consumption tax, but LDP didn't do so. And then energy policy, no more genpatsu is strongly preferred. And then not much difference among security, among the political parties when it comes to the support security policies. But there is one outlier is Japanese voters do not support JCP's position that is to abolish the Japan-US security treaty, which is, I think, good news for those who support the US-Japan security alliance. Now, but we did some similar experiments in 2014 and 2017. We got essentially the same results. LDP's policies are not necessarily popular, but LDP had a landslide victory. But this time we added additional experimental component. So we showed LDP label. So this is a table that I presented. So party A and a party B, or party 1, party B, and which party would you support? But we also prepared another set of conjoint experiment in which party labels are randomly assigned. So the contents of the tables are exactly the same, but one of the profiles is always LDP, another profile is always one of the opposition parties. And then I estimated how much voters, respondents are more likely to choose profiles, policy packages with LDP label. And then what we found is LDP party level effect is so large, much actually larger than we expected. And even interesting and surprising, and perhaps, well, not really surprising according to the similar study in the US, but when people see LDP label, even when the contents of the policies are not LDP, they tend to support that particular policy packages. So for example, if the policy profiles include JCP's policies on security, which is to abolish the US-Japan security treaty, if the respondents see LDP label, they still are more likely to choose that particular policy. So conclusion, so the voters' policy preferences are not necessarily voters' the vote choice. So LDP being the winner of the election this time, it was 3 consecutive lower house elections, that doesn't necessarily mean that Japanese people support LDP's policies discussed, stated in the policy manifestos. And this time, 2021, we found a strong party level effect. And we are still discussing why the LDP party level effect is so strong, but this is something we want to discuss in our academic paper. Finally, LDP dominance. This is a big question, perhaps the biggest puzzle in the literature of Japanese politics today. And our study may suggest that LDP dominance is likely to continue, but without voters' policy support, because LDP is the only party that has a strong party level effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusaku. And next we will hear from Yusola Kwan. Yusola, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and share your screen.
All right. So I'm going to mostly focus on gender representation and in relation to the context of this year's election. And I want to first start by providing some pre-election context. So Japan had about 9.9% of women in the lower house before this election. And that puts the country in the 160th out of 193 countries in terms of women's representation. And for a long time, Japan has had a lower or considerably lower share of women in politics compared to other comparable democracies. Nevertheless, I think there were a couple of reasons why some might have hope that this election might be different. First, this was the first lower house election after the enactment of gender parity law in 2018. And in the fifth basic plan for gender equality adopted by the government last year, government set a goal of raising the ratio of female candidates to 35% by 2025. And neither of these had mandatory targets for parties. Nevertheless, the fact that government seems to take the issue seriously might have given some hope for some people that things might be different in this election. Nevertheless, there's little change after the election. So in terms of female candidacy, there were less than 18% of females in this election, which is very little change from previous one. And also LDP, the ruling party LDP, and its junior coalition partner Komeito had the lowest share of women candidates as in the previous election. In terms of party pledges on gender equality issues, all major parties have several pledges on gender equality issues. However, these issues were not that salient during the campaign. Nevertheless, a lot of those pledges were shared across parties and then similar to each other. And those include measures against sexual violence and crimes, support for childbirth and child rearing, support for women's employment and health. And with the exception of LDP, all other parties supported selective surnames for married couples and LGBTQ rights. And as I said, gender equality issues themselves were generally had lower salience in this electoral campaign, but these two issues probably were the relatively more salient gender-related issues in this election. However, despite the similarity, there are key kind of difference, I think, between LDP and opposition parties in terms of their approach to gender issues, and especially between LDP and left-leaning opposition parties. For LDP, they put all these woman-related policies under economic agenda related to new capitalism. It seems like they have very economic approach to woman-related issues. For them, woman-related policies are mostly labor market policies, and it seems like they see them as part of their economic growth strategies to address labor shortages. And it seems like they are less interested in social rights of women themselves. On the other hand, left-leaning opposition parties, in addition to labor market-related policies for women, they also had a focus on representation and social rights for women. And as a result, they had some of the policies that were included in opposition parties' budgets, but excluded in LDPs. And those include anti-discrimination measures, gender equality education, gender mainstreaming, and gender quotas. And these are the policies that are not necessarily related to economic growth, but they are more related to representation and social rights of women. In terms of electoral outcomes, there were the actual number of women actually decreased from 47 to 45, despite all those government initiatives. And LDP again had the lowest share of women with about 7%, which is very similar to the previous election. So one could ask why there are so few women in politics in Japan for so long. And I think we could answer this question by examining both supply side and demand side factors. And first, to look at the supply side factor, I think one of the major issues is the lack of institutional mandates, such as mandated gender quotas. And of course, gender quota should not be the panacea for this gender equality issues in politics. But when there's such a severe lack of women for a long time, it can actually provide it can kind of provide a good starting to increase women's representation. And when we compare Japan to other comparable democracies in East Asia that have very similar electoral systems like Taiwan and Korea, you'll notice that both of them actually have mandated gender quotas. So Taiwan, for instance, has more than 40% of women in Congress today, and they had these reserved seats for women for a long time, and then those reserved seats are removed today, but they still maintain about 30% of mandated gender quota in PR tier. In case of South Korea, although the country still suffers from relatively lower share of women, they have maintained like about 50% of mandated quota since 2004. And since this mandate, the share of women has increased from 5 to 19%, almost quadrupling. Another factor, another key difference between these two countries in Japan is dual candidacy. So Japan has dual candidacy rule, which allows a candidate to run in the district competition as well as PR tier at the same time. And the way Japanese parties use dual candidacy is by following the best loser rule. And under this rule, parties will often nominate a candidate who lost in district competition by the smallest margin on the top of the party list for PR tier. And what that means for women and marginalized candidates from marginalized groups or first-time politicians is that women or these first-time politicians often face disadvantages in district competition because they tend to have a weaker establishment and weaker root in their constituency. And in the presence of best loser rule, that kind of disadvantage they face in districts can be reproduced in PR tier. And that's kind of unfortunate because a lot of scholars would argue that peer systems are actually more favorable for women's representation. And the presence of best loser rule in a way kind of reduces benefits of peer systems for women. Lastly, LDP dominance, I think, is another major issue. So I think after this election, it's been clear that LDP is less interested in actively promoting women in politics, despite all those government initiatives, or at least it's not their priority. And of course, there are several female politicians, prominent female politicians from LDP, but the fact the party has so much influence on individual candidates and politicians, and the fact of factions, and those factions are often led by senior male politicians, have so much influence on individual politicians. A lot of prominent women politicians endorsed by the party end up being somebody who embrace very conservative party lines on women's issues. Nevertheless, we could also consider demand-side factors. If there's enough, voter demand for more women's representation, maybe even LDP has to reorder their priorities, right? Nevertheless, it's not clear whether voters in Japan have strong preference for female representatives. I think that research today kind of provides mixed evidence. Some studies will show that Japanese voters would not discriminate between female and male politicians, or others, on the other hand, will show that Japanese voters actually prefer male politicians to females, given the same qualification of candidates. Nevertheless, there has been a series of feminist movements in recent years in Japan, and since there has been growing interest and concerns about gender equality issues among, especially among the younger generations and females, and those have been manifested in protests like Flower Demo or Me Too or Witchy movements. While those movements are very meaningful in the sense that they provide a safe space for victims of sexual violence to raise their voice, and it also provides a very important support network for these victims. Women's movement in Japan have been relatively fragmented and decentralized, and therefore these movements so far had relatively limited impact on legislation and politics. So is change possible? I mean, can you expect a change in the future? I think that depends on whether growing interest that we see in gender equality among the young, especially among females, can translate into demand for substantial changes in national politics. And for this transition happen, I think at least one of the two factors should be satisfied. First, the salience of gender issues in elections should increase to the degree that voters actually make electoral decisions based on gender issues rather than other balance issues like economic issues. Or I think voters should be able to see the clear connection between women's representation and policy benefits. So when voters see a woman politician, right, do they actually see them and think that they will be benefited by this woman politician's representation? Do they actually think that their interests will be represented by them? And if that connection is not clear, even though there is growing concerns and interest about gender equality, voters may not think that more women's representation is part of the solution. So I'll stop here for now, and I'll happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusola. And last but not least, we will hear from Charlie. Charlie, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and share your screen.
Good. Okay, great. Thanks, Yusola and Yusaku. So already covered lots of great themes of this most recent election. Another one that kind of hit the headlines was certain examples of younger candidates somehow upsetting long entrenched older members of the LDP in particular. So for example, we could think of Hideshi Futori within the CDP, who's 44, surprisingly defeating Secretary General of the LDP, Akira Amari. The other side has happened as well. So we might think, for instance, about Takashi Fujiwara, who's just 38, defeating the longtime, DPJ kingpin who ran under the CDP label, Ichiro Ozawa. So what I'm going to think about today is sort of, was this emblematic of sort of a broader trend? Was this an election, a moment of significant generational change, or should we view it more as a return to the status quo, as lots of other headlines have discussed? I'm going to talk about this election and, younger politicians, age demographics of politicians in sort of historical perspective, and then comparing Japan with other countries. And then the second thing I'm going to think about is sort of, does it matter, should we be concerned about sort of the shortage of younger politicians in the Japanese diet? So even though we had these, examples where young people won surprising victories, if we look at the overall trend, it turns out that this election had the fewest number of candidates and MPs under 40 in the last 30 years. So just 5% of the entering MPs are under 40 years old, and just 9% of candidates were under 40. Just 10 years ago in 2012, there were about 300 candidates who ran under 40. There were 99 in this last election. So there's a pretty, sharp decline. Why is this happening? Well, a lot of it has to do with, 2009 and 2012 and the switching back and forth between the LDP and the DPJ opened up a lot of seats, and there were a lot of first-time candidates, a lot of younger candidates. And then since then, the LDP has consistently, maintained 80 to 90% of its seats in each election. There just hasn't been a lot of turnover, a lot of spaces for new candidates. So there aren't a lot of younger candidates entering now, although the 2009 to 2012 LDP cohort is particularly strong. And so while there aren't very many members within the LDP who are sort of in their 30s, there's actually a big group that's sort of early 40s to mid 40s that are starting to enter cabinet positions. If we think about Japan in comparative perspective and compare it to other OECD countries, it turns out that Japan now is the second to last in the OECD of MPs under 40. So Japan at 5% is just ahead of South Korea at about 3% of MPs under 40, and just behind the United States at about 8% of MPs under 40. So really, trailing behind other countries. Could also think about the cabinet and the Kishida cabinet, and sort of how old is the Kishida cabinet compared to past cabinets. So there's been a lot more variation over time. So almost nobody enters the Japanese cabinet before the age of 40. Only 3 people have done it in history. So here I'm showing the average age on the y-axis the y-axis ranges from 55 to 70. I'm looking at the last 50 or so years. So there's a lot more variation. So the average age of the Kishida cabinet is 61 years old. This is relatively young historically, though a bit older for recent years. It's a little older than the last Suga cabinet was, but a bit younger than the last Abe cabinet was. There's 2 members who are in their 40s, but a large majority of the Kishida cabinet is members in their 60s. So it's 15 or so members, maybe 12 members, who are in their 60s. And again, if we compare Japan with other OECD countries, we find that Japan has the highest average age of all OECD countries in terms of the cabinet. It's actually the only cabinet right now where the average age is over 60. The US was also a member of this exclusive club under Trump, but the Biden cabinet just sort of sneaks in with an average age of 59. So again, Japan has sort of, what I'm trying to show here in trend is just that Japan has, a declining, especially in recent years, number of younger legislators. While the average age of the cabinet hasn't necessarily increased, it is relatively high compared to other countries. So the second part I just want to think about is, is how concerned should we be? I mean, Japan is the oldest country. Should we be worried about this lack of youth representation in Japan's House of Representatives? So some, again, ripping from the headlines might say, well, maybe we shouldn't be worried because after all, it's the young that really like the LDP, right? So lots of headlines are talking about how younger voters are the most likely group to support the LDP. Here I am showing the PR exit polls about the PR component of the latest election. So this is where voters choose a party. And the red is showing, so the x-axis shows different age groups. The red is showing people who listed the LDP, and the blue is showing people who listed the CDP, the sort of main opposition party. So we see that 18 to 19 is the highest group, the only one above 40%, and saying that they chose the LDP. And it seems to kind of trend down. It's a little bit higher for 70 above, but really younger voters were more likely to vote for the LDP. And the opposite is true for older voters, who are more likely to choose the CDP relative to other age groups. Why is this the case? Again, looking at exit polls, it seems that it probably has something to do with maybe economic factors. So Japanese younger voters, it's kind of interesting, they're choosing the status quo, but kind of in line with Yusaku's work, it doesn't seem like they necessarily like, you know, the LDP in general, or like the LDP's policies in general, but they are sort of happy with the rebound that has happened in the job market, right? So for younger voters, what they really remember is that the DPJ years coincided with sort of the Lehman shock, the tough times for the job market. And you don't really see, I don't know, a belief among these younger voters that there's sort of an actual alternative to the LDP. So it's a status quo, but it's not necessarily that the younger voters are super conservative, or that they're voting for the LDP because they love all of their policies. It's been a tough time to get them excited about an alternative. And one way we can see their lack of excitement is the voter turnout among young people has just been continuing to decline. Now, we don't have the voter turnout broken down by age for this most recent election just yet, although the ministry has released the results for just 18 to 19-year-olds, which saw like a slight, maybe 1% bump up from the last election, but still very low. And here, looking at voter turnout, you can see that, going back to the late 60s, it used to be the case. I've highlighted sort of people in their 20s in red, and compared it to the group with the highest turnout, people in their 60s in blue. And we can see that people in their 60s and 20s used to vote at much more similar rates in the late 60s, but in much more recent elections, that gap has widened as voter turnout among young people in particular has fallen below 40%. And I don't know what it will be for this most recent election, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be a huge jump up. The last thing that I've kind of thought about too is, apart from sort of thinking about voter apathy among young people, or political apathy among young people, less interest in these elections, is whether younger and older politicians might pursue different policies in office. So again, we don't have the Asahi Todai kind of does this great elite survey of candidates before the election, and they haven't published at least the individual level data for this most recent election. So instead, I took the last 3 elections and kind of aggregated it together. And I looked at a particular question which asks candidates to list sort of pick from a bunch of different issues about what their top 3 policy priorities are in office, and took a look at what percentage of candidates picked education and childcare. And then this is showing the results of a regression where I've actually controlled for a host of other factors like party, what district they're from, gender, for example. And I found consistently that younger candidates, even within the LDP or across parties, are about 5 to 10 percentage points more likely to say that they'll focus on education and childcare or view this as a top priority for the government. With the older candidates in their 70s, 5 to 10 percentage points less likely to emphasize these issues. If I showed you sort of pensions and healthcare, these trends would be reversed. And there's even greater differences on a lot of liberal social issues. So if we looked at, for example, should women be able to keep their surnames after marriage, or support for gay marriage, those percentages go toward like 10 to 20 percentage point differences across this age gap. Again, even controlling for all sorts of differences between younger and older candidates. So in terms of takeaways, the 2021 election did seem to feature some prominent examples of younger challengers defeating older entrenched incumbents. And in work that I've done and work that Yusaku and Dan have done as well in their conjoints, have found that Japanese voters, when young people run, seem pretty supportive toward younger candidates. So it doesn't seem to be an issue where voters don't like younger candidates. A lot of the issues have to do with sort of the supply side, trying to get young people interested in politics enough to run, and trying to remove some of the barriers, expensive elections, an electoral system that requires high name recognition, things that make it very challenging to sort of get the kinds of resources, political capital that you need at a young age to actually be able to run and win and get a seat in the lower house. The broader trends, even though there's been these interesting single examples, the broader trends show a decline in younger candidates over the last 10 years, still very low levels in Japan relative to other countries. And this could be worrying for all sorts of issues important to young people, as well as younger people's broader engagement in politics. So I'll stop here, happy to talk more during the discussion, and thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Charlie. So all 3 of those presentations give me a lot of ideas and questions, but I'm going to first bring in some of the questions from the Q&A from our audience. And I encourage others in the audience, if you have questions, please do type them into the Q&A function. And if they're for a specific speaker, please indicate that in your question. So my first question from the audience is for Yusaku from Amy Katalinak, who writes, several scholars have documented the rise of programmatic politics after Japan's 1994 electoral reform. Her impression is that in the 2000s, the LDP's policies were more aligned with what most Japanese voters wanted. So you can think of Koizumi's success in 2005 with postal privatization or kind of reform-oriented policies in general. And she wonders, if we had run this experiment then, do you think that you would have gotten different results? And what is the main reason for why the LDP has been adopting policy preferences that are not broadly popular? So why does the LDP adopt these policies that are out of step with the population? And then Yuki Shiraito adds, is it surprising that the LDP would have a strong party brand, given that they're the only party apart from the JCP and Komeito who have lasted more than 10 years in recent years and have supporters?
So thanks for asking those questions, which are quite interesting and important for us to think about the many issues and puzzles in Japanese politics. And the Koizumi election, Yusei Senkyo, the postal reform, the election was, in a sense, an exception. That was a rare case of the single issue election. So we could see the match between support and the policy. But generally speaking, the general elections, of course, includes many policy issues. So I think this is just just a guess, but except the 2000 the Koizumi single issue elections, I see the disconnect between vote. I guess the disconnect between the vote choice and the policy proposals. And then this also relates to the Amy's another question. So the LDP, so the manifesto elections. So I'm not sure what my co-authors are thinking, but manifesto election may not be that effective in Japanese politics. Well, first of all, the campaign period is really short. And then all parties propose lots of policies. The Japanese voters do not necessarily read all of these and understand, but they appeal voters based on those policies to say that the policies are important, but the policies that are really important are perhaps not the policies written in manifestos. Like, for example, many different kinds of regulations and job securities and much more structural issues. And Stephen Reed, I think he's also attending this, recently published an interesting paper about LDP dominance. But LDP essentially, monopolize the entire policy processes. And then the monopolization of entire policy process is actually not written in the new policies that they write in the manifestos. So when voters see LDP, they may not pay attention to the policies written in the manifesto, but they may think about what LDP has done in the past and then what LDP is likely to do in the coming years. So that may be one potential reason why LDP party effect is strong. And Amy, I know your work in programmatic politics and intergovernmental fiscal transfer, but we estimated the party label effects across different age groups and also across different regions the same, not just in rural areas, not just old or young people. Across different regions and across different the age groups, we found strong party level effect. And the last, Yuki's the question, party level effect may not be surprising. Yes, it is perhaps not surprising because LDP is a single dominant party and then the largest and most well-known famous political party in Japan. Right, but there is an interesting debate in American politics. Some of you may know this literature, but when politicians or parties appeal voters based on the policies, does policy messenger matters or the policy content matters? There is an interesting debate about this, and there are lots of experiments designed and administered by political science, and I think the debate is still ongoing. But in the case of Japan, as far as I know, this our 2021 conjoint experiment with party level experiential component is the first to understand this, first to make a contribution to this messenger effect and content effect. And in the case of Japan, the messenger at the party level effect is way, way stronger than the policy content. So what does it mean in the literature of comparative politics, party politics, and also the Japanese politics is still something I want to discuss with my co-authors and also everyone interested in Japanese politics. So even after this, the event, we look forward to receiving more comments and discussions through emails and other things.
Great. So I have some questions for Charlie on young voters, young generation. So Amy Katalinak writes, the fact that younger voters are choosing the LDP in relatively high numbers for economic reasons suggests that the party has managed to completely avoid blame for the structural problems in Japan's economy, which of course it presided over. So you mentioned that maybe younger voters have this bad taste in their mouth from the DPJ years, but of course the economy collapsed under the LDP before the DPJ took office. So her question is, how do we think it was able to do this? There's also a question, related questions from an anonymous attendee. Why do you think the rate of younger voters is so low in comparison to 10 years ago? So what has happened 10 years ago versus today that results in the drop off of younger voters in turnout? And Shiro Kuriwaki wonders what you might find, given that we know that there's a mixed member electoral system in Japan with the single seat districts and the proportional representation of vote, and individual candidates may have something of a personal vote that they bring to the election contest, as well as their party reputation. He's wondering if you were to compare the individual candidate votes of older and younger candidates from the LDP to the party's support in the PR district in the same single seat district area. Do you think that younger candidates would over or underperform the kind of average party support for the LDP? So why don't you take those questions, Charlie?
Yeah, sure. Lots of great questions. Tough questions to answer. But on the first one, so about why don't younger voters blame the LDP? So I think that a lot of the sort of status quo bias among younger voters has to do sort of with just the lack of a viable alternative. So when I was thinking about Yusaku's presentation and how he was kind of emphasizing how come the LDP does so well when its policies aren't popular. The flip side I was kind of thinking about is like, how come the CDP or the opposition parties do so poorly, even though their policies are popular? And I think that some of the policies of the CDP are quite popular among young people. But I just think that there's a sort of lack of trust after the DPJ years, and then perhaps maybe a recency bias too, where younger voters, they kind of just personally experienced the tougher years in the job market under the DPJ, and then they experienced the recovery under the Abe years. So Abe was particularly popular among younger voters. I don't know about Kishida personally. I mean, Konotaro was quite popular. Even Suga, at least in the beginning, was pretty popular among younger voters. So it seems like, for whatever reason, since 2012, the LDP has kind of been able to capture and hold on to that support from younger voters. So second question is, why do I think this decline over the last 10 years or so? It seems like the trends in both youth turnout and young people running for office kind of are matching the trends in terms of competition, trends in terms of sort of excitement among the general public about the election, about the possibility for change. And so they kind of ebbed and flowed with the possibility of like real opposition party in 2009 and have declined since then. So that's sort of the best answer I can give. The other one might be, at least on the candidate side, I know you asked about the voters, could be that I'm not as sure that as recently top level leaders have been getting involved in the sort of the mobilization side of recruiting young people to run. So it used to be the case that Koizumi, and then in 2009, really Ozawa, kind of personally played a significant role in recruiting young people who may not have thought about political careers to stand for office. And so you had a lot of young people running who were not second generation politicians like what Dan studies, but were celebrity candidates, for example. So without sort of like that personal touch and recruiting, that could be part of the decline as well. And lastly, I'll just quickly try and answer Shiro's. It's a great question. So I haven't looked at specifically what you're asking. I have looked at sort of local politics where you don't have the party label and found that younger candidates seem to perform, controlling for other things or trying to rule out other factors, seem to perform as well or better than older candidates. And so I suspect that this would be the case if to the extent that you can control other things. And then, like I was saying earlier too, and I mean, I know in your work as well, and Dan and Yusaku's, we found that at least in the experimental setting, it seems like they get a higher vote share. But I haven't actually taken a look at it, but it's a great idea. Thank
you, Charlie. So we have a question in the Q&A from Yuki Shiraito that also relates to a question that I have for Yasola. So Yuki writes whether we can talk about, I think I'll direct this to Yasola first, about the supply of female candidates, but also asked about the supply of young candidates in Japan in comparison to the supply of dynastic candidates, for example, which seems to be a never-ending supply of those in Japanese politics. And I wanted to add that the Nikkei did a kind of hypothetical simulation of what the results might have been if the electorate, or if the vote was based on the exit polls of different age categories, 40, I think 40-year-olds, 40 to 50, 60 and above, and also by gender. And whereas the actual results for the LDP were 261, if it had only been women voting, that would have been 230 seats, and the CDP would have gone from 121 seats to 149 seats. And then there's the opposite direction of effects for age groups, that if it's only 40-year-olds voting, the LDP would have done as much as 295 seats rather than what they won. And so I guess my question for Yasola, if you want to get us started, is do you see an emerging gender cleavage in Japanese politics where women are more likely to vote for a party like the CDP than the LDP? And if that's true, what does that suggest about maybe what the CDP or other opposition parties might do to try to build more support for future elections, perhaps recruiting and fielding more women as candidates and so on?
Thanks for the questions. First, to answer Dan's the last question about the women voters. I saw this recently announced analysis by Nikkei newspaper, and basically I'm sure many of you have seen. I think this newspaper article became controversial because it showed actually younger people are supporting more younger people are supporting LDP than older people. But I think another thing that was noticeable there is the young female voters seems to support LDP less than male voters. But the question is whether that tendency is strong enough to bring actual regime change. And as I said earlier, I say in case of Japan, gender issues, I mean, there are definitely growing interest in gender equality issues. You ask I remember the NHK surveys right before the election, if you ask especially younger females what their policy priority, that policies related to family issue or childbirth, child rearing are the biggest policy concern right after economic issues. So it seems like they do have policy interest in women-related issues, but I just don't think that that's the strong enough to mitigate their other economic issues. And even those issues, I think for many voters are considered as almost like a balance issue. Right, so that when it comes to party choice, it seems like a lot of voters still think that LDP is still a better option or suboptimal option than other opposition party, and because they're more competent in providing those policies. And lastly, one thing that I want to also add is that the second point that I try to make, in order to bottom-up change to happen, I think the female voters should be able to see the connection between the woman's representation and policy benefits. And given the political environment in Japan, I don't know whether the connection is too clear. And of course, there are some kind of female politicians who have the feminist policy positions, but I think a lot of prominent female politicians that we see are not necessarily the case. Right? So if you think about Sanai Takaichi or Miu Sugita, who recently kind of made very controversial remarks about the victims of sexual violence, right? It's not clear whether those women, when there are more women in Japanese politics, voters would think that would actually represent their interests. I think the connection between descriptive and substantive representation is not too clear to voters yet. So that's that. Should I answer about the dynastic?
If you'd like to, I was going to say it'd be interesting. I don't think I saw this in any kind of public opinion polls, but the gender breakdown of support for Noda Seiko and Takaichi Sanae versus Kono Taro and Kishida Fumio in the LDP presidential contest among LDP supporters would have been interesting to analyze. But please go ahead. If you have something to say about dynastic candidates, and then I'd like to hear Charlie's thoughts on the supply of young candidates running for office.
Yeah, maybe about the dynastic candidates and the female politicians they're linked to dynastic. I think this is definitely the topic I think then will be more. I have more expertise, but not just in Japan, but I think over in Asia, like if you look at a lot of female politicians, both local and national politicians, I think a lot of them have dynastic connection, and partially because I think the political the entry barrier is really high for females. And then dynastic kind of ties become one of the really important doors for females entry into politics. And that's very common, I think, across, not just in Asia, particularly in Asia, but also across other democracies as well.
Charlie, do you want to add your thoughts on the supply of young candidates?
Yeah, I'll just say two kind of quicker things. So one is that I think it's a challenge of many sort of underrepresented groups, but one thing is that, because it's so difficult to win election at a young age, it's definitely been the case that traditionally younger politicians, especially within the LDP, have been much more likely to be, second generation or third generation politicians. And more broadly, we could think about how the type of person who's actually able to win, an election for national parliament under 40 in Japan maybe like very different than the average young person. They might be elite though in all sorts of different ways, graduating from Todai, spending time going to elite US universities, socioeconomic reasons. So I think it is a question, on the supply side too, about can we attract a more diverse set of young people to be able to run competitive elections and win election. And I'll just say the second thing I was going to note is that before the pandemic hit, there was I'm going to blank on the name, but there was a working group within the Diet of younger politicians, especially led by the LDP, that was sort of coming up with proposals to try and increase the number of young people who are running for office. And the two things that they were focused on was lowering the minimum age of candidacy, from 25 to be, some wanted it to lower it all the way to 18 for all offices in Japan. I think before the pandemic hit, it seemed like the more realistic outcome was that it's going to be lowered to 20 for all offices. We still might not get that many people who are 22 running for national office, but there was an idea at least that it might be a symbolic gesture, a la, lowering the voting age as well, to sort of get people, some kind of signal from the central government that they're interested in younger people's voices in government. And the other thing that was discussed was eliminating the minimum candidate deposit. Just Japanese elections quite expensive for all sorts of reasons. One of them being that you have to put up a significant amount of money just to be able to run. And if you don't get enough votes, you lose that money. And so one nice thing about, if going along this route was that it would not only probably encourage more young people to run for office, but probably other underrepresented groups, including women. How much of an effect could that have? I know Dan has studied it before, but I'm not sure if it would be transformational, but at least both of these reforms would go, at least show some sort of, central government interest in increasing this sort of more young people running for office.
Thank you, Charlie. So we have 5 minutes left, and I think it might be fruitful to end on a kind of policy-oriented or future-oriented note. And so I'm wondering, political scientists, academics in general, like to find sort of what's wrong or problematic of different elections or contextual situations in democracies around the world. And Yusaku has pinpointed that perhaps there's a lack of policy engagement or ideological congruence between what parties in Japan, particularly the LDP, are proposing and what voters actually want. And some people might normally think that's not a great situation for democratic representation. And similarly, Isola and Charlie are looking at this underrepresentation of different groups in society, whether it be women or young people. And again, from a normative perspective, generally political scientists think that having a parliament that reflects the diversity of society is a good thing for policy outcomes. So what would your sort of concrete suggestions be, or kind of forward-looking proposals for how Japan might think about the outcome of the 2021 elections, and what might be a solution for improving on the issues that you've pinpointed? Maybe I'll start with Yusaku.
Well, that's a difficult question, but as you know, we've been discussing this among us. I mean, the collaborator for our project, but I've been thinking that the campaign period is ridiculously short, and this is something we need to discuss much more actively. I don't have a comparative statistics, but I guess the 12 days for the first order election is perhaps one of the shortest. So it's way too short for Japanese people to understand, the actual policy debate. And then, so the lack of association between vote choice and a policy, the preferences may be due to this, but I don't know. But so if I have to say one policy issues that we need to discuss more is this sort of small electoral reform, the campaign regulation. Kenneth McWilliam, of course, has an AJPS paper on this, but it's worth reconsidering the campaign length. Yeah.
Great, thank you. How about in terms of gender representation, Sola?
Yeah, I think the continuous LDP dominance definitely is one of the biggest obstacles in terms of top-down changes for gender representation. And for that to change, I think both elite-led movement and from top-down, and then also bottom-up grassroots movement have to occur simultaneously, and they should be connected. So I remember, like, when I was dissertating in my PhD program, I interviewed one of the first feminist movement activists who is actually a lawmaker in Sweden. And basically what she said is that during the time, they were actually bring the female politicians together across different parties to really like work on this issue and have very like kind of close connection with the civil society. So, and I know something like that is kind of going on in Japan, like Seiko Noda and other progressive women are trying to kind of create this like cross-party group to really work on gender quota right now. And if that movement can take momentum and then also have very close connection and work together with the civil society, I think maybe that can have some positive change.
And Charlie, in some ways, with Japan's age demographics, overrepresentation of elderly politicians is not all that surprising, but I know your research speaks a little bit to this. So if you want to suggest your policy recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the, understandably, the issues I was talking about before were sort of put on the sideline because of focusing on the pandemic. But I think returning to the issues which seem to have support, not only within that youth working group, but also within the broader LDP about, eliminating the minimum deposit system, reducing the minimum age of candidacy, anything that can be done to lower the general cost of elections. I mean, bigger things, if I went back to that cross-national pattern, the types of countries that tend to have, very few young people in public office have single member districts, right? Or there's systems where you really have to have, high name recognition, a lot of personal resources, which are just difficult to accumulate at a young age. Japan does have proportional representation, and countries with proportional representation tend to have more young people, but the type of PR that Japan has really encourages all candidates to behave like single member district candidates. And it's just like it's a rescue system sort of for the ones who did pretty well, but just barely lost their district. So it's not really the type of PR where the parties are getting like super involved in providing like a broad slate of candidates. Mm-hmm. So if there was a different type of electoral system, that's a bigger wish list, I suppose. That could be helpful. And the last thing I'll just mention is thinking about how to build political ambition among young people, right? How do we get more young people interested in running for office. I haven't studied it, but I imagine that it probably has to be dealt with in schools to begin with, talking more about politics in Japanese schools, civic education type side. But, all sorts of work needs to be done there.
Well, on that note, we are just about at the end of the hour, and I want to thank our panelists, Yusaku Horiuchi, Isola Kwan, and Charlie McLean. Thank our sponsors, Weatherhead East Asian Institute and Apex Study Center at Columbia University. And special thanks to the audience who attended the live version of this webinar. And thank you to all of you who are listening in the future at home via YouTube when this is posted. And we wish you a pleasant evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone.